Right. And I meant to stream this last week. I apologize. I, for whatever reason, just forgot to go back there and start it. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll start. Our Holy Father in heaven, we thank you for our day. We thank you for this time that you've given us to come together and study your word, and pray that you would help us to understand the purpose for all that you've preserved for us. Help us to apply things to our lives as we find application, and help us to have a greater appreciation and understanding of your will for us and for your plan for your people and for the providence that you've shown in the works of man. We pray all this in your son's name. Amen. All right. So we're doing part two of Hezekiah. I just we spent a lot of time on the first part of Hezekiah's reforms, and I felt like it was that was appropriate. And but I do want to spend time also on the second part of his story, uh, and I guess a little bit on the third part. There's three primary stories that come up with Hezekiah. And where's my? If you remember, we talked about Hezekiah uh, having about a, depending on who you ask, a 10 to 14 year co-regency with his father Ahaz, which continues that pattern that we so often see: bad king, good king, bad king, good king. That for some reason we see Ahaz, who was one who might have been the worst king to date in Judah's history, followed by his son Hezekiah, who, as we talked about last week, his day one job appears to have been to get Israel back on track in serving God. His first act is to get the temple cleaned up, to assemble the priests and the Levites, and to get them to sanctify themselves and purify themselves, and take the Passover, and do all that they needed to do. And so uh, we see the revival that takes place, and Second Chronicles 30 particularly talks about this. And it ends that chapter in verse 20, where it says, "Thus Hezekiah did throughout all Judah, and did what was good and right and faithful before the Lord his God, and every work that he undertook in the service of the house of God, and in accordance with the law and the commandments, seeking his God, he did with all his heart, and prospered." And I think that's a it's interesting to me that the story goes from there right into chapter 32, because what is the story that takes place in chapter 32? Well, that and then Jerusalem, but yeah. Mhm. Sennacherib, yeah, he's going to invade the area of Judea. This is just to set some things up, and this is an interesting thing, I think, just to set the stage. If you were going to describe the spiritual state of Judah, as we left off last week, how would you describe it? At least how it's described in the reading. Okay, they were faithful. What else? Okay, okay. Uh, we're not just talking about a superficial faith. It appears that they were invested. They were rejoicing. They were excited about everything that was going on. We see this really great picture of revival in Jerusalem during that time. And if you remember, it wasn't just Jerusalem, because Hezekiah had sent out word throughout the area of the 10 tribes as well, who had already been dispersed. Assyria has already taken all that area by now. He sends notice out and invites them all to come in and worship and observe the Passover, and most of them didn't, but a few of them did. And so there was a lot of zeal. And if you remember, what happened was that the first thing they did, if you remember, before they took the Passover in Jerusalem, what did they do before they even participated in any of that? What did they have to do before they were before they? Okay, okay, that was the first thing. The Levites and the priests got everything together that they needed to do, but there was something that the city had to do first too. What did they have to do first before they could worship God properly? Well, they'd do that. Remember, we talked about this. They had to get rid of all the idols. They went throughout the city, got rid of all the high places. And maybe my memory may be failing me, but that's the first time that we read at that detail of that kind of a cleansing going on in Jerusalem. This was a little bit of a different thing. It appears that they were taking this a lot more seriously than they had. And so when we read the idea, it's uh, I'm trying to remember. I think it's back in the Kings. It might be in the Chronicles that it says that there'd never been a Passover like this observed in Jerusalem since the days of Solomon, not before or since. And I suspect what he's referring to is that there had never been a time when Jerusalem had been really dedicated to saying we're going to serve God and we're going to get rid of all these foreign influences and we're going to purify ourselves the way we need to be purified. And so they were they were all in on this. They appear to have been in a good space spiritually. And it's interesting that that chapter 32 opens up by saying, after these things and these acts of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah and encamped himself against fortified cities, thinking to win them for himself. Now, if you read that, does that seem kind of odd to you? That, you know, what Judah's, the threat of the prophets has always been what? You repent or what? Or be destroyed. I'm going to send armies in and they're going to take you captive and disperse you unless you get rid of your idols and repent and do everything I've called you to do. Well, Judea does that. We get rid of all the idols. We take care of everything that we need to take care of. We are on board. We're faithful to God. And yet Assyria still comes in. Okay. Okay. Mhm. Right. I'm sure there were. Now the people that laughed at him were in Israel, but still, I mean, I don't know that Israel ever made it to 100% faithfulness. That would be a stretch, and that may be part of what's going on. Uh, what else could be? Why else would God allow this to happen at this point, or might He? I guess because we're not told. Why does God allow God's enemies to attack God's chosen people? Possibly, maybe to test. All right, you've resolved yourself to serve me. Well, let's see how it goes because it hasn't. The track record has not been good. So maybe this is a situation where God is now going to test that faith. You know, it says after these things and these acts of faithfulness, Sennacherib now is going to come in. And it might very well be as well that um, this is simply how the world worked right now. As we talked about, Assyria has been coming in, and if you remember what prompted, we glossed over this a little bit, but we read about this in the First Kings account. Why is Assyria coming after Judea here to begin with? Do you remember? What was their relationship with Assyria before Hezekiah? Look back at 2 Kings 18 and notice up there in verse 7 and 8 where it's talking about Hezekiah's accomplishments. What does it say? Okay. Smote the Philistines, rebelled against the king of Assyria. What does that imply? Uh, mhm. All right. Mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, and Sargon was the guy that came in initially and had taken Israel and had gone in, and apparently he's not only taken Israel and dispersed them, but you know, when it says that Hezekiah rebelled against Assyria, what does that imply? For me to rebel against something, what does that imply? Yeah, if I'm rebelling against somebody, that means they're in charge. So Hezekiah and Israel apparently or Judah are apparently under some kind of a vassal state at this point, which is not surprising. Assyria is this massive empire. You know, we talked about how they were kind of they'd been dormant for a while and had been some internal issues, and Syria has come in and taken some things, and Assyria finally got their act together and said enough of this. And so they came in, and they're currently in the process. They've taken Syria, they took Damascus. We read about that. They're also down fighting against Egypt and getting all the southern borders secured. And that kind of comes into play a little bit in our story here. But they're going through all this. And in the process of all this, they basically at some point, probably when Ahaz was in charge, Ahaz says, "Look, don't bother me. I'll pay you money. I'll do whatever you need to do." And so he's become a vassal state. And it's around was it 705, I think it is, that Sargon dies, and his son Sennacherib takes over the throne. And what typically happens when you get a new empire is everybody says, "Let's see if we can push this a little bit." And I suspect that may be why Hezekiah says, "I'm not paying you anymore. I'm not doing anything for you anymore. I'm going to rebel against against your reign." And so, around 701, it says in 2 Kings 18:13, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah, Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. So not only is he going to come up, but he's basically going to have a lot of success. He's going to wipe through and take just about all the cities. In fact, ends up right at Jerusalem when this story is going to take place. Now, I want to show you a little bit about Lachish. Lachish is kind of a key uh, element of this story, and we actually know a lot about what happened with Sennacherib and Lachish. It's useful because as you read this, again, it's really easy to think, well, this is just a story. Well, this is a story that's pretty well documented in history as well. There's a lot of things that we can learn about. Mhm. Yeah, I'm yeah, I'm getting there. But if you remember Lachish or Lachish as it's pronounced is down here. This is basically we talked about this uh, beginning of Solomon's reign and later on that there were these fortified cities that were spread throughout the land. Like Lachish is basically the last fortified city between here and Jerusalem. So what's going on at this point is Assyria has gone down into this area where where Egypt is incurred and is trying to rebel. And so Assyria is taking care of all that. And once they get that kind of in place, they come back up here and they're going to take care of Jerusalem now. So on the way up here, they're going to go right through Lachish and up through Jerusalem. And so basically Hezekiah is in Jerusalem and he hears that the Assyrian army, hundreds of thousands of people have just stormed up there and taken this city. And we know a lot about the Assyrians and what they did, as Laura mentioned. There's the Lachish release. I'll show you a couple of pictures of those just to give you an idea of the size of this, um, of what we're talking about here. This is a picture of the double gate. If you see, let me go back to here real quick. Kind of see where this is the city up here, and if you'll notice, by the way, they've got these nice little wire sculptures they're intended to show the archers and the chariots and the siege engines and things. That's where the Assyrians were coming up to conquer this to attack the city. The gates are off here. You can just kind of see them a little bit over here to the left, and just to give you an idea of how big these things were, you can see these are all people. It had a double gate formation. You come up the long road here, and so if you're an army and you manage to get through this gate, then you go up here into this next wall. Now you have to fight through this gate up here, and so this was a very well fortified and very well walled city. This wasn't a primitive setup at all. This was going to take a lot of work for them to do. And there you can see the steepness of that's the ramp going up into the gate. Um, these are actually the remains of that second inner gate, so you can get an idea of how dense and how big this was when they were going through. I just want to show you this because this is useful. I think this is the inner gate, and how they were typically structured was they had these different chambers within the gate. And if you ever hear about people, elders sitting in the gates of the city, that's what it's talking about. They would have these chambers where if you were going to do business in that city, if you want to meet with the city elders, or if you wanted to sign a contract or do whatever, or had some kind of like when we see, for example, when Boaz goes and makes his claim, it goes and finds his relatives and takes him to the elders and says, I have a claim, anything like that you would do in this area. So they could kind of take you off into one of these little cubicle areas and sit down and do whatever you needed to do. And the other thing they did, where Luke is standing, is they had in a lot of these cities, essentially they had a high place. What they would do is it's basically designed like a mini tabernacle. You've got there would have been a veil here, an actual veil, but there's a separation between the holy place and the most holy place, with the altar would be back there, and they would have an altar for Jehovah, but they would typically also have an altar for somebody else. If you wanted to, whatever God you wanted to choose, you could go in. And what's interesting, by the way, is they found that in this particular one, in several of the most holy places, they found a round rock formation that they finally figured out was a toilet. And what had happened was that when Hezekiah or when one of the other kings or Josiah would go in and get rid of the altars or get rid of the idols, it wasn't enough to just get rid of them. They had to defile that location so it would never be used that way again. And so they would literally take a toilet and put it in that place where that idol was to 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 completely make sure that it was never used again. And so it's just a little extra information. That's there you go. That's the toilet area right there. That's the holy place. This is where the idol would have been. And I put this picture here to just give you an idea of how big this is the siege ramp. This is what Syria built, that whole huge mountain. Yeah, yeah. This is what Assyria assembled to go up to the city wall. And basically, the idea was you build a siege ramp up to the wall and you just walk up the siege ramp and climb over the wall. In this case, apparently what happened was they didn't need to do that. They ended up storming the gate and broke it down. But when you hear about some of the stories, in fact, there's the little archers and all the Lachish reliefs have pictures of archers. They have pictures of sling throwers and swordsmen and spearmen, and showing all the different ways in which the Assyrian army would attack. In fact, there you go. See, there's the slingshot throwers. Let's see if I got another picture. These are from the Lachish release. And you can see there's the siege wall, there's the chariot, there's the archers, and I think I've got a picture of yeah. This is what the Assyrians did to people after they took their city. This is how bad these were not good people. That they, when the king's writer is very matter of fact about how this happened. He went in and took the cities. Well, this is what he did when he took the cities. He mounted people on stakes and stood them outside the city walls. That was what Assyria was known for doing. And so this was and I think it's important to kind of keep that in the context of what all's going on, because when we read about what's about to happen, when Hezekiah hears from Lachish that Sennacherib is there and he says, I'm coming to you next, what is, what does Hezekiah do? What is Hezekiah's response to that threat? Do you remember? There's actually a couple of things that he does. The king's account gives us a slightly different perspective. What does it say in chapter 18 that Hezekiah did? Well, he will, but not yet. It's the first thing he does to try to stop Assyria. He tried to pay him off. He did exactly what his father did, which is I'm going to go strip all the gold and the silver and take everything out of the temple and go send it off to Sennacherib, and hopefully maybe he'll leave us alone. And there's a lot of dispute about there's not dispute necessarily, but we don't really know exactly what happened next. Some people have argued that what happened was it was just too little too late. And Sennacherib says, thank you for the money. I'm still going to come. And that seems to me to be the most likely thing. It's possible that he did send it. He sent it later. There's the sequence of events is not really known, but what we do know is that this is what Hezekiah does, and he's not rebuked for this. It's hard for me to imagine that this was a good thing or pleasing to God. But you can kind of understand, this is the last city, and if I'm thinking, is God going to deliver us? Well, I don't know. He hasn't delivered any of the other cities yet, and so now it's basically down to Jerusalem. And we also know in the Chronicles account, it tells us a little bit more as well about what he did in terms of preparing for this. What are some of the things that we read about him doing in Second Chronicles 32? Okay, to stop the springs. Why do they do that? Yeah. Why should we give them? They're going to siege us, and we're going to give them drinks. And what's the great thing about that, if you are y'all familiar with Hezekiah's tunnel from an archaeological standpoint? Basically, we found the tunnel. In fact, do I have a pic? Let's see if I brought that where that picture is. I'll come back to this in a second. But this is us in Hezekiah. That's Laura in Hezekiah's tunnel. That was the best picture I got in the tunnel. I did not do a good job. I think she might have better pictures than I do. I couldn't find them, but this is about the size of the tunnel. And what happened was one end started in the city, one end started down at the spring, and they literally started digging from each ends and met in the middle. Anybody that ever tells you that people in the 7th century, 8th century BCs were just a bunch of idiots that didn't know what they were doing. This is a pretty remarkable. They tell the story that they dug until they could hear the other people digging on the other side. I think they ended up being about like 2 feet off in their calculations. And they have, I wish I'd gotten a picture of it, but they have an inscription. Actually, you know what? They took the inscription and moved it to the museum, I think. Yeah, there's a replica. That's right. But they have a replica there of the inscription where they indicated that this is where the two tunnels join. So it was a pretty impressive thing. And so he does this. He bolsters the walls. He goes and does this. And I do think it's important. We've talked about this a little bit that trusting God does not mean that I just say, you know what, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to let whatever happens happens. Hezekiah does all these things, but what does he do after having accomplished all these renovations and all taken all these precautions? What does he tell the people? Yeah. Do not be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or dismayed before the king of Assyria and all the horde that is with him, for there are more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. And so the people took confidence from the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. So they're rallying. They're going to trust in God. There may have been some shaky moments, but they're going to stand firm when the Assyrian army comes. And so it's in this context that we see the story of the Rabshakeh, who is basically the whatever the title would be, the herald or the messenger, the chief messenger, the cupbearer. He was basically the guy that Sennacherib is going to send to speak on his behalf. Sennacherib at the time is still at Lachish, waiting, and so I'm assuming he's sending the Rabshakeh there not only to set up the siege and get that ready to go, but also to see if we can come to an end and talk them out of doing all this. And so the Rabshakeh comes and has all kinds of things to say to the people that are sitting on the walls. In fact, if you remember, what are the city officials? What do they tell him when he's up there? He's up here talking to the people and telling them what's about to happen. What do they ask him to do? You remember? Second Kings 18:26 mentions it.
Please speak to your servants in Aramaic, for we understand it. Do not speak to us in the language of Judah within the hearing of the people who are on the wall.
Okay. Somebody doesn't think that the people are gonna hold up on this, right? We don't want them hearing all this. This is all propaganda. We'd rather not hear this. And of course, that just I'm not sure what they thought was going to happen at this point, but it's almost like that just renews his efforts. So Rabshakeh's speech is directed at the people on the wall. He says, "Look, you're the people that are going to die when we come in, and you've seen what we do. You know what happened at Lachish. We know that none of you are going to survive this, and it's going to be a slow and painful and horrible death, but it doesn't have to be that way." And he makes the argument as he comes up to the people. We'll look in the king's account first because he says there's some slightly different things that are brought out in each account. But he says in verse 19, say to Hezekiah, thus says the great king, the king of Assyria, on what do you rest this trust of yours? Do you think that mere words are strategy and power for war? In whom do you now trust that you have rebelled against me? He says in verse 21, behold, you are trusting now in Egypt, that broken reed of a staff which will pierce the hand of any man who leans on it. So he's been trying to make an alliance with Pharaoh, and Assyria has just come from there. They're taking care of him, and now they're coming back up. And he says, okay, you can't trust Egypt, you can't trust any alliances. But he says in verse 22, if you say to me, we trust in the Lord your Lord our God, is it not he whose high places and altars Hezekiah has removed, saying to Judah and to Jerusalem, you shall worship before this altar in Jerusalem? In other words, what's his point? You think God's going to deliver you? Why is that a false hope?
You can't even worship in here. You have to go all the way down to the temple.
Well, they're at the temple. They're in Jerusalem now. Uh, but what's the argument here? What's he say? Look at what Hezekiah's been doing. What has Hezekiah been doing? Is that's true, right? How does he interpret that? Yeah, you're cutting off God. You think your God is supporting this Hezekiah? Look what he's doing. He's going around tearing down all the high places. He's forcing you to come here. It's only in Jerusalem. Why would God be in favor of somebody who's going around and destroying his places of worship? And I find this argument really interesting because if when you read Rabshak, I may do a lesson on this one day. How many of his arguments are so similar to the arguments that we will see from the world today about God and about worship and about religion? Why would you think God is okay with all these? You're saying that we can't have these magnificent light shows and big music and all this other and all these festivals and you're just saying that we can't do any of those things. Why would God be okay with you saying that? Why would God be okay with you telling us all the things that we can't do in worshiping God? What's wrong with doing all these things? And you get the idea, by the way, that Rabshakeh clearly doesn't have a real strong understanding of Israel of the law of Moses. He knows what he's observed. He knows what he's heard. They probably learned a lot about Jerusalem and Judea from the people that they conquered in Israel. And as we already talked about, their knowledge of the law was pretty shaky. They didn't really have a good understanding of it anyway. And he's probably saying, look, Israel was doing fine with all this. Why are Israel had all these high places. Judah's taking them away. That they must be in the wrong. And so he argues, God's not going to be with you because you're already turning your back on God anyway. And and he goes down and he tells them in verse 29, do not let Hezekiah deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you out of my hand. Do not let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord by saying, the Lord will surely deliver us, and this city will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Do not listen to Hezekiah, for thus says the king of Assyria. He goes on and says, look, these are all the good things I'm going to do. If you will just come out, everything's going to be wonderful. We're going to take you to this we got a nice place for you. You'll get your own vineyard. You'll have everything will be wonderful. It'll be a better life than you have right now. Doesn't that, by the way, sound kind of like what Satan tells us? Just give it. Just do it like the world, and you'll be amazed how much better things will be. You just do it our way. Do the things that we want to do. Uh, but he says down in verse 32, do not listen to Hezekiah when he misleads you by saying the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered his land out of the hands of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods and he goes through and lists all the different gods. Um, it says in verse 36, but the people were silent and answered him not a word, for the king's command was, do not answer him. And so at least, there may have been some doubt, there may have been a little shakiness, but they're not responding. They're holding firm, and they're holding the line for now. Now notice, actually, by the way, let's look back at the second letter, because we find out in chapter 19 that Sennacherib gets distracted by some situations in Egypt that he has to deal with, but he sends a letter by the Rabshakeh with a follow up just to make sure that we haven't forgotten about you. We're coming back. You know, but he says in verse 10 of chapter 19, do not thus you shall speak to Hezekiah, saying, do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you by promising that Jerusalem will not be given into the hands of the king of Assyria. Behold, you have heard what the king of Assyria has done to all the lands and devoted them to destruction, and shall you be delivered? So he's basically saying your God is no better than any of these other gods. Now, in the Chronicles account, if you look over there's a couple of other things that he says that they're pretty similar. Um, he talks about in chapter 30 or in 32. In 32, he says that he talks about him taking away the high places. Who among the gods have been able to deliver anyone from our hands now. Uh, and he goes on, and it's interesting that the Chronicles writer kind of drives this point home. In verse 19, they spoke to the God of Jerusalem as they spoke of the gods of the people of this earth, which are works of men's hands. He talks about our God as if our God is nothing more than an inanimate statue. He talks as if it's just like everybody else. And I think that's kind of the thing that the Chronicles writer is trying to bring out over and over again. Look, all these other gods, the Assyrians defeated. And he thought that he could just come in because he assumed that our God was just like their God. But what he found out was that was not the case. And so, as a result of this, what happens? He sends this letter, and chapter 19, and also the passage in Isaiah talks about this as well. What is Hezekiah's response to the letter and the threats? He prays. He takes the letter from Sennacherib and takes it to the temple and lays it out before the Lord and prays. He sends his people to go find Isaiah and ask Isaiah what's going to happen and what God is going to do. And of course, Isaiah reassures him and tells him, in fact, let's see, I think it's in Second Kings in chapter 19. He gives this prayer, and I think we mentioned this in the prayer class on Sunday that Hezekiah's prayer is not about save our lives, spare our fortunes, help us to. It's Do you hear what he's saying about you? He has insulted the living God. Uh, now, as he says in verse 19, save us, please, from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you, O Lord, are God alone. In other words, there's no other God that could deliver us from what's going on right now. It's certainly true. No other nation in the world would be able to stand up to what's happening right now. This is what I skipped over. This is the Sennacherib prism. That got cut off a little bit. This is along with the Lachish release. This is a record of Sennacherib's conquests in that time and some of the things that he did. That's why we know pretty much that this was about 701 BC when this took place. He has records of it. And what's really interesting about it is that he talks about the idea, he references Hezekiah by name, or he says he left Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage after he'd sent in the spoils of the city. It's a typical way for a king or a monarch of that time to describe what's going on, because what's he leaving off? Yeah, he didn't actually beat Hezekiah, but he had him caged, he had him pinned in, and we're just going to leave off that inconvenient part that we couldn't actually take the city. And so he alludes to this. He just leaves out the part that we read in Scripture, which is, of course, the King's account doesn't say this, but the Chronicles account tells us that the angel of the Lord came in and wiped out the army essentially. And it says in verse 21, the Lord sent an angel who cut off all the mighty warriors and commanders and officers in the camp of the kings of Assyria. So he returned with shame to his own land. When he came into the house of his God, some of his own sons struck him down there with the sword. It reminds me a little bit of how God dealt with Herod later on in the New Testament, how God deals with Pharaoh, how God deals with Nebuchadnezzar, and so many kings in that time who exalted themselves, who were being used by God to do God's will, and decided that it was because of their own greatness that they were acting. Now, during that time, look over at Isaiah 22. I wanted to make sure to bring up some of the parallel passages in Isaiah, because I think specifically this passage gives us some interesting insight into what's going on. Uh, let's read verse. I'll start the first part of this chapter, verse 22. This is the oracle concerning the valley of vision, which, by the way, there's some discussion about what specifically that's referring to. It's clearly referring to Jerusalem or the valley around Jerusalem. Is it calling it the valley of vision in that this is the vision that Isaiah is seeing? Is it the valley of vision in that, if you remember, the valley of Hinnom was where they would go down and offer their pagan sacrifices, and maybe that's in reference to all the false gods and the soothsayers and things that they were relying on. But he says in verse 1, what do you mean that you've gone up, all of you, to the housetops, you who are full of shouting, tumultuous city, exultant town? Your slain are not slain with the sword or dead in battle. All your leaders have fled together. Without the bow, they were captured. All of you who were found were captured, though they had fled far away. Therefore, I said, Look away from me. Let me weep bitter tears. Do not labor to comfort me concerning the destruction of the daughter of my people. For the Lord God of hosts has a day of tumult and trampling and confusion in the valley of vision, a battering down of walls, a shouting to the mountains. And Elam bore the quiver with the chariots and horsemen, and Kir uncovered the shields. Your choicest valleys were full of chariots. The horsemen took their stands at the gates. He has taken away the covering of Judah. In that day, you looked to the weapons of the house of the forest, and you saw that the breaches of the city of David were many. You collected the waters of the lower pool, and you counted the houses of Jerusalem. You broke down the houses to fortify the wall. You made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool, but you did not look to him who did it, or see him who planned it long ago. Now, does that passage, when you read verse 9 through 11, what does that sound like when we talked about in First Kings or Second Kings? Or I'm sorry, Second Chronicles. What's he talking about? You made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool. Yeah, he's talking about the Hezekiah tunnel. Look at all the things you did when you knew this was happening. It says he describes your choicest valley were full of chariots. The horsemen took their stands at the gates. He has taken away the coverings of Judah. When you think about what that he's saying, the idea that you thought you were something, you were behind your walls, and you thought you were untouchable. But when the Assyrian army rolled out, what did you learn? You're you're just another nation. You're just another city, and there's nothing you're going to be able to do about this. You were in a hopeless situation at that point when the enemies of this nation came and filled the valley. And there's some question about what he's referring to in this first part when he says, "You who are full of shouting, tumultuous city, you're slain or not slain with the sword or dead in battle." It's almost like he's saying, "You're up there on your rooftop shouting as if you haven't just had hundreds of thousands of your soldiers killed. That this hasn't been uh, as if you somehow accomplished something." And there's some discussion about whether this prophecy is taking place after the siege has been lifted, after God has delivered them, or after Isaiah has given them the news of what's going to happen. Uh, there's some indication later on because he says down in yeah, down in verse 12, he says, "In that day, the Lord God of hosts called for weeping and mourning, and for baldness and wearing sackcloth, and behold, joy and gladness, killing oxen, slaughtering sheep, eating flesh, drinking wine. Let us eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. Lord of hosts has revealed himself in my ears. Surely this iniquity will not be atoned for until you die, says the Lord God of hosts." There's either the idea that hey, it doesn't matter anymore. We're all going to die anyway, so why don't we let's just have a big party and don't worry about it because it doesn't matter, or it could be the response the idea that hey, we've been delivered, everything's wonderful. We're not going to worry about the long term problem that, by the way, we still have not dealt with, which is what's still the problem here? Who do they turn to? Who do they trust? Yeah, they look to themselves. Now, it doesn't sound like that's what Hezekiah is doing, but it appears that Hezekiah's devotion wasn't fully shared by a lot of the people in Israel, that there were still some issues with people who were kind of trusting in themselves, that really were kind of ignoring the problems that they had. There was an arrogance, there was a haughtiness, and it's shown in this second half of this chapter, in verse 15, where it says, "Thus says the Lord God of hosts, come, go to this steward, to Shebna, who is over the household." Where do we know that name before from in the readings? Where did we read about Shebna already? I haven't read him, but if you've done the reading, you remember him. Well, he wasn't one of Sennacherib's people, but he shows up in that part of the story. If you remember, go back in chapter 18 of Second Kings. I'm sorry, Second Kings chapter 18, and I think the Chronicles account says it as well. Yeah, Eliakim the son of Hilkiah, Shebna, and Joah said to the Rabshakeh, "Please speak to your servant." They're the ones that come out to the wall and ask him, "Look, can you speak a different language so my people don't hear?" Um, there's some interesting things that Isaiah has to say about Shebna. He says in verse back in Isaiah 22, in verse 18 or 16, says, "What have you to do here, and whom have you here, that you have cut out here a tomb for yourself, you who cut out a tomb on the height and carve a dwelling for yourself in the rock?" as we've been reading, we've made a big deal in the Kings and Chronicles, especially in the Chronicles, about where the kings get buried. You remember where they get buried? The good kings, at least, the kings that they like, where are they buried? Yeah, yeah, they're buried in the tombs of David and his seed in the city of Jerusalem. Yeah, this is a big deal. It's an honor. Now here you've got the steward of Jerusalem, who, assuming that we're taking this literally, is apparently involved in building himself a pretty nice little tomb too. And it describes him later on. Um, it's down in yeah, down in verse 18, back in Isaiah 22, where it says, "He will seize firm hold on you and whirl you around and around and throw you like a ball into a wide land. There you shall die, and there shall be your glorious chariots, you shame of your master's house." There's the indication here that Shebna apparently thought pretty highly of himself. He liked to ride around the city in his chariots and make a big fuss about who he was. He's building this big tomb, and he's garnishing a tomb for himself essentially, and saying, "Look how glorious I am, and look how people are going to remember me." And there's a couple ways to think about this. As I think about it, there's a literal idea. There is actually a tomb that some excavators found in the 1800s that is from around this time, and it's a pretty impressive tomb being that was built, and it was not for one of the kings. And some people have argued that may be what Shebna was building. It may very well. So he may be literally talking about that. But when you think about that idea of basically you carved for yourself a tomb, from a figurative standpoint, you've got this giant city with these giant rocks and you think that you're going to be safe in here. But what this city really is your tomb because you're not safe in here without God. And there's that idea of, and you're going to see that when Babylon comes on the scene, 100 or so years later, the same thing. We're behind the walls of Jerusalem. They can't do anything to us. We're going to be just fine. And yet God says, you have put your faith in all the wrong things. You have glorified self. As a result of that, he says, in that day, he says, I'm going to get rid of you. And this man Hilkiah, or Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, is going to take your place. He says in verse 21, I will clothe him with your robe, will bind your sash on him, will commit your authority to his hand, and he shall be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. And I will place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open and none shall shut. He shall shut and none shall open. And I will fasten him like a peg in a secure place, and he will become a throne of honor to his father's house. And they will hang on him the whole honor of his father's house, the offspring and issue, every small vessel, from the cup to all the flagons. In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, the peg that was fastened in a secure place will give way, and it will be cut down and fall, and the load that was on it will be cut off, for the Lord has spoken. Just think about just the literal application of this. All right, here's this man, Eliakim. I'm going to give him this post. And I'm going to make him like a peg. When the Bible talks about a peg in a secure place, what's the imagery there? What do you do with a peg stuck in the wall? You hang things on it, and you do that because you know that peg's sturdy. You can hang everything. It's like you can entrust that peg with whatever I choose to hang on it. Uh, and essentially, I'm depending on that peg. And you see the imagery there, the idea that here's somebody that I'm going to establish, and he's going to be secure. In fact, he's going to be so secure that Judah's going to put his trust and his confidence in him, and they're going to rely on him. And at some point, what's going to happen? Is that peg going to stand up or not? Eventually, it's going to fall. The idea being that you're going to have somebody that's going to be a great leader, not like this guy. This guy was irresponsible. He was a bad steward. He enriched himself. I'm going to cause him to fail, and I'm going to put a good steward in his place. But how long is he going to last? Well, he'll last a little bit longer, but he's still not going to be someone on whom you can place your trust because ultimately Israel is going to be destroyed, or Judah is going to be destroyed, Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Um, but when we think about the bigger picture of this, does that language sound familiar? That as he describes him, he says, I'll place on his shoulder the key of the house of David. He shall open and none shall shut. He shall shut, none shall open. Fasten him like a peg in a secure place. He will become a throne of honor to his father's house. What does that sound like we're talking about there? It's a similar idea, isn't it? And in fact, if you go over to Revelation chapter 3, in Revelation 3 verse 7, when John is John is writing the revelation of Jesus, and Jesus addresses the church of Philadelphia. He says, "The words of the Holy One, the true one, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one will open." Yeah, that's a pretty clear reference back to what we read here. And this is why, again, why do we study this stuff? Why do we care about what Isaiah says about some guy, you know, 3,000 years ago? Because of this. Because here's a man who, as good as he was and as responsible as he was, you put your trust in him and he failed you. Now, who are we putting our trust in? This is the one who will not fail. He's been given the keys to this. He has been given the stewardship of Israel, spiritual Israel. He is the one on whom you can now depend because he's never going to fail. Uh, no one will be able to, when he opens it, nobody's shutting it. When he shuts it, nobody's opening it. Go ahead. Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so here's someone that you will finally, ultimately be able to literally hang your hat on, literally and figuratively. But the idea now is that Israel continues to put its trust in the wrong things, the wrong people, and it keeps failing. And we see this one more time at the end of the story. I didn't really pick up on this until this time, so maybe I'm wrong. But the next story. So we read that Hezekiah has been delivered, the city's been delivered. What's the next story? Hezekiah. What happens to Hezekiah after Assyria has been pushed away for the time being? I know. We'll finish up. Yeah, Hezekiah gets sick, and what does he do? Well, what's he do first? How's Hezekiah finds out? Isaiah comes and tells him, "Set your house in order. You're going to die." What is Hezekiah's response to that? What's a little more time, and what does he do to get that? Cries and prays. Isaiah hasn't even made it out of the courtyard when God says, "All right, go back." Uh, so Isaiah goes back and says, "You know what? God has heard your prayers. You will not die." Now he says there's a couple of different versions of how this goes, but ultimately, either Isaiah offers a sign or Hezekiah asks for a sign of how he will know, and Isaiah gives him a choice. Well, okay, look, see that sundial on the wall? I'll have it move forward 10, or I'll move it back 10. And Hezekiah does what? What is Hezekiah's response? Yeah, make it go back. That's interesting, by the way, because you remember I think there's a tie in Isaiah, because if you remember Ahaz, when Isaiah goes to Ahaz and says, "Ask of a sign that this is going to happen." Remember what Ahaz's response was? Do you remember what he said? Did he ask for a sign? I know it's been probably 3 weeks or so. But Ahaz's response is, "I would never deem to ask of a sign from God." And we talked about the fact that he's probably not saying that out of reference and respect to God. What he's really saying is, "I don't really care about this. Just move on, and let me just move on." Hezekiah has enough faith to say, "Absolutely, I would love to have a sign from God. And in fact, let's make it something that's really, really hard, because I know that God can do this." So that's the level of faith that Hezekiah has. And he gets that. So one who has been told, the king of Israel who represents Judah and Jerusalem, has been told, "You are going to die." And he turns to God and he says, "God, spare me, give me more time." And God says, "Okay." What has just happened in the story of Sennacherib? That's exactly what just happened. God's people cried out to God. God has said, "Your time is up. You're going to be destroyed." And they say, "Please have mercy on us. Give us time. We'll do better." And God says, "Okay." And he saves them. And what happens? How does Israel use its newfound lease on life. How long does it take them after Hezekiah dies for them to sink back in idolatry? Not very long. They take God's grace and mercy and patience and they use it as a license to go even farther into sin. What does Hezekiah do after he's given this new lease on life? How does the story end up at that point? He gets a message from somebody. He gets a message from Babylon asking what?
From King Hardy VI.
Okay. Okay. hmm What's been their big problem? Israel's problem from day one when they get into the land of Canaan. They come to Samuel and say, "We want a king." Why? I want to be like God said. I want you to drive them all out. You're going to be a holy, distinct nation, different from everybody else. I don't want you impacted. I don't want you to be influenced by them. Israel continually says, "No, no, that's not what we want. We want to be like everybody else." So Hezekiah gets this notice from the people in Babylon, and what is his thought? Come on in. We can be friends. We can have alliances with you. We can, and he takes them, shows them everything. Uh, and I may come back to this analogy a little bit later because that idea of revealing everything to these people is going to come back. I know I'm in a in a more graphic way, but I want to make sure this point is made because Hezekiah is basically telling you what's going to happen with Israel at this point. They're going to be taken away into captivity because they refuse to accept God's grace. All right, I apologize. I'm running late. Stephen, did you have? Okay.